I'll give you guys the short introduction to Daniel Swain. He's the new Time 100 Next emerging leader, probably the only person from UC on that list, which is pretty impressive. He's a climate scientist with the California Institute for Water Resources. He joined us just over, it hasn't been a year yet. It was official on November 1. He came here from UCLA, and I'll let Daniel tell you about his other affiliations. Welcome, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Pam, and thanks everyone for your attention today. And yeah, it is nice to be coming up on the 1 year A&R anniversary for me personally, and it's great to be here. And so I know some of you are probably working from home today with the IT issues, but I may see some of you after the talk. IRL in person since I am here in the offices at the moment. You may recognize the second floor backdrop. So, as Pam mentioned, I do wear a couple of hats, formally and probably more informally. These days, my affiliation is 100% with UC A&R, but I also work with the NSF Center, National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in Boulder, Colorado. Sort of really the singular global specialty center for atmospheric science, so weather and climate research, essentially. And I've had that sort of that concurrent role since 2016, so it's been a while now. That's going on 10 years. Uh, but what I wanted to talk about today was this is actually a little bit of an amalgamation of several different conversations, talks that I've had with some different audiences over the past year or so, given that it's been kind of a tumultuous year for so many reasons, for so many people in different contexts, but in particular from an information landscape perspective. The interactions with the media have changed. The media itself, who is the media? What is the number of people in the country employed by media organizations? The type of content that they're pushing out, and the kind of interactions that domain experts and academics and scientists or practitioners are having with the media. All of these things are, it's complicated enough at baseline, and now it's rapidly changing over time. So it's a dynamic landscape. Just wanted to offer some thoughts both on my personal experience, give a little background with that, and then also offer some hopefully useful practical advice about how I operate in that landscape as somebody who is not a professionally trained communicator, but somebody who now has that as a very large, even dominant part of my role, and do so in a mass media setting. So with audiences of these days millions of people. Hopefully offer some useful advice, and then hopefully we can have a conversation at the end. I don't have an extremely long presentation. Hopefully it won't be. I do have a tendency to run a little bit long, but hopefully we have got plenty of time for discussion at the end here. So let me just make sure that, okay, there we go. So I guess I wanted to just quickly overview, well, how did I get here? And uh, I actually have an undergraduate degree from UC Davis, and coincidentally gave the departmental seminar in my original home undergraduate department of UC Davis Atmospheric Science just yesterday over on campus. And so that's where I started out. I've been a lifelong weather geek. I originally got my atmospheric science degree thinking I'd become what's known as an operational forecaster, so essentially a National Weather Service meteorologist. And so I am credentialed to do that. But of course, these days I do something rather different, although I still am a weather geek at heart. You may see some of my weather photos pop up occasionally when I go chasing cool clouds. But so I have a bachelor's of science in atmospheric science from UC Davis, and then went on to pursue a PhD in Earth system science at Stanford right afterwards. I went straight on from undergraduate degree to the doctorate program there, and that was sort of my transition more into the climate world from weather. But I've long retained that that love of weather, that passion for weather, and increasingly the scientific and practical connections between weather and climate have increasingly become a real main focus of my public engagement activities. So I completed a postdoc at UCLA and then became a researcher there, essentially research science role at UCLA for a number of years. And as recently as last year, for the first part of my A&R appointment, there was a little bit of overlap between my UCLA appointment and my A&R appointment. But now, as I mentioned, I am officially 100% UC A&R and grateful for it. And also have an affiliation with, as I mentioned, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is in Boulder and is that global center for weather and climate modeling and research over decades. So my official role within A&R, administratively, I'm an associate researcher, but in practice, what I am is a climate scientist communicator, a little hyphen there, as much as hyphenated terms can throw some people off. I think that there's a very deliberate reason why I use that terminology to describe it, and actually that will be something I talk about on a subsequent slide. But what does this mean in practice in terms of, that's sort of the CV timeline chronological version of how did I get here. But what does it really mean in practice of what I do today? Well, it means that I am trained as a physical scientist, so as a meteorologist, an earth system scientist, a climate scientist. So my domain background is in the physics and the thermodynamics of the fluid atmosphere, as they say. And in practice, this means that I went essentially, as I mentioned, from weather to climate and to these days to an increasingly broad portfolio of natural phenomena, particularly as they relate to hazardous um, activity or disasters of some kind. And I also serve these days as you may know, as I guess, objectively highly visible public-facing weather and climate communicator, although I have conversations on a fairly wide range of things that are even peripherally related to weather, climate, climate change, earth science, natural hazards, disasters, public policy, and actions as they relate to all of these things. So, an expanding umbrella, if you will, with weather and climate and wildfire at the core of it. And so my role today, and the degree of public visibility that I have right now is essentially the product of now over a decade of intensive, as I guess the word I would use to describe this engagement with mass media, both through really extensive and sustained engagement with journalists on one side of it, and also as somebody who has been directly engaging with people via social media and creating um, text, visual, video-based content that reaches large audiences, both through my own platform, Weather West, and then also the more traditional big social platforms, as well as the more traditional in-person type engagement, meeting people not just figuratively where they are, but also literally in space and time as well, with community events there too. So in my scientist communicator role, fundamentally what I lead is weather and climate and natural hazard related research. So I do have primarily, or at least maybe a 50-50 balance, let's call it, of research and larger or broader societal engagement. And my geographic focus is, of course, primarily California, but it does extend considerably over a wider range throughout the United States and really globally as well. And that's true both for the research and the engagement side of things. I essentially act as an extreme weather and climate change and wildfire, natural hazard, topical related liaison to news media. So I will do as I'll talk about a little bit later, hundreds of news media interviews per year. So that literally means on average one every working day. I've done two today so far, for example, and also directly with governments from local to international bodies on any number of topics related to these sorts of things. And one of the things that I'm trying to do now, because historically for me, this has been something of a bit of an emergent program, emergent in the sense that it was through me taking advantage of sort of opportunistic things that popped up rather than a more coherent or organized linear path toward mass engagement, is to think a little more strategically about how to uh, potentially build up that capacity for mass audience or mass media engagement within ANR and the UC system in general. So that does include in our 21st century, where everybody is constantly on their phones or in email or on social media apps, meeting people where they are, not just in space and time, but also where increasingly many of us spend most of our time, especially younger Californians, which is on the internet and on the web in various forms. And also to collaborate, maybe in a slightly more traditional way, with academic, governmental, and private sector entities on any number of science to action or science to practice type of things. So I mentioned I would define scientist communicator with a hyphen here because I think it's a useful paradigm in understanding what I'm trying to do and what I'm hoping that more people can do, both within ANR and elsewhere, but particularly within ANR in the sense that it is an explicitly knowledge extension oriented entity within one of the largest and most respected public university systems in the world. It's the obvious place to build this kind of capacity and expand it from beyond traditional, largely agricultural centric models to other audiences using other techniques that reach people who might not be reached by that traditional uh, in-person approach. And really, I just want to offer some multiple definitions of what this is. And these are not conflicting or alternative definitions. I think all of them are simultaneously just as accurate. And what I really want to emphasize is this covers a lot of different kinds of roles, a lot of different kinds of people in the world of science and practice of science. So really anybody who works in an extension program, I think, can relate to at least one of these. Um, which is to say, a scientist communicator, in my mind, is could be a practicing scientist, designing and conducting and publishing peer-reviewed research. That's certainly something that I do, and it allows me to stay very up to date, really to truly be on the cutting edge, partly because I'm contributing to the newest research out there, but also because as a side effect of contributing to it, I am out of necessity, I stay up to date with what other people are doing, which is arguably the much more important part of that, because what I actually research is but a small piece of the body of literature, but this really keeps me in the moment, going to conferences, doing literature reviews, having conversations with leading scientists in the field to get a better sense of where we are collectively, rather than my personal contributions to the research per se. A scientist communicator is an engaged communicator, offering critical analysis and broadly disseminating knowledge, which is to say, not focusing narrowly on a very specific subdomain, or perhaps worse, just on what I actually produce research-wise, which, as I mentioned, is just a tiny sliver of what's out there, but really working to synthesize and connect the dots and really think about what the bigger picture trends are telling us, and whether they and especially where those might diverge from conventional wisdom or from the way we used to do things, or what the evidence as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago might have shown. Because, of course, we live in a dynamic world and things change over time. This is something I'm reminded of literally every week, as recently as yesterday, where some paradigms that I had been using or leaning on, I guess I could say, were challenged in a really constructive way scientifically over at UC Davis. So, constant process of not just learning, but integrating that new knowledge into practice. It, scientist communicators should also be serving as a bridge builder, as I mentioned, spanning not just disparate disciplines, but also different kinds of institutions, academic ones, practical, implementation focused organizations, governments, universities, the private sector. That's something that I think is in the core wheelhouse of an entity like ANR, or large university extension programs generally. But I think thinking about new ways to do this, with bringing new kinds of institutions into the fold, not just the ones we're so used to, is, I think, potentially a constructive way to move forward. And I think in some ways, as much as this might sound like a very different job, I do often feel like the most important part of it is my role as a storyteller, which is to say, the ability to connect the dots, to create narratives that are rooted in objective science, that they have to be correct. They can't be made up, they can't be fanciful, they can't be biased to the extent that we can control our own biases, but they also need to be accessible. They need to be compelling. They need to be something that people actually want to listen to and will retain what the essence of what you're trying to communicate. So it's different than other kinds of storytelling. I'm not a fiction writer, and if I were doing that, that would be scientific malpractice, of course. So it's thinking about what is the most engaging but also a factual way to communicate the most essential pieces of what we know about a particular topic. In my case, weather and climate, but in your case, it might be whatever it is your domain happens to be. It does sometimes mean being a crisis responder, which is maybe the most uncomfortable of all of these and the most challenging. It means working with governments and various agencies and entities and the public at large to minimize harm when things aren't going well, when there is a disaster or an emergency of some kind. And there are lots of different kinds of emergencies, arguably, that someone working in ANR could be working with the people of California to address potentially in real time with real consequences and without necessarily the ability to fall back on peer review or committees or other sorts of feedback that might help you temper or tune your response to something. Sometimes you have to respond very quickly, and I'll talk more about that part of it in a later slide as well. And I think maybe the simplest way to describe all of this collectively is that I view myself as a context provider. I think that's maybe more important than the science that I do. It's more important than the individual interviews that I do, but it's maybe in this syncretic sense, bringing things together and offering what I think is the most appropriate way to bring together disparate threads, placing research and also contemporaneous world events, because that's often why people are asking the questions that they are in any given moment in a perspective that is both scientifically appropriate and also allows people and entities to potentially do something about it, that puts people into a position so that they can respond accordingly. So the one sentence version of this, and feel free to borrow this if you find it useful, is that my definition of a scientist communicator is that they are a public-facing domain expert of some kind, any domain works, whose work includes not only the generation of new knowledge scientifically, but also deep and sustained contextualization of that knowledge broadly in society. And that's a deliberately vague definition because I want as many people as possible to identify it in their roles within ANR, within UC, or really anywhere else too. We need more people in these kinds of roles quite desperately. Why, you may ask? Well, it's probably no surprise that just about every contemporary issue you can think of is complex and it doesn't lend itself to a single bullet point explanation. That's certainly true of climate change and extreme weather and wildfire and disasters generally, as is my own bread and butter, but it's also true, as we've lived through a global pandemic. Rather recently, a new bird flu related one potentially threatens. But think about all of the fallout from that societally and culturally, and in terms of information and social media and AI, and what the current federal response to vaccine policy is. All of these kinds of things are not simple, not just scientifically, but also in how society has sort of taken them up, and how we have responded collectively or not to the issues of the day. Certainly, this is a moment where the complexity of geopolitics is abundantly clear. But I think the broader thread here is that just about every major global system at this point in time is has many nodes in it. It's complex. It's got a lot of moving parts. And so understanding the totality of these systems and how all those individual moving parts work together is not easy. And I view it as my role to connect those dots as much as possible And we desperately need other domain experts in domains where, for example, I am not an expert to be doing this too. And I see that as something that people in an extension program, so with an A&R, are uniquely positioned to do, partly because it's literally in the job description, but how we do it, I think, is something that probably we should be thinking about how to evolve it for the 21st century extension goals. And that is largely because, unfortunately, as much as I wish it were the case, the saying that the facts speak for themselves could not be less true, particularly in 2025. Mis and even active disinformation abounds, and in some cases has been actively fomented by people seeking to sow discord and confusion for strategic reasons that vary. This is made even easier in an era where really anything that's dramatic goes viral, and it doesn't need to be factual. In fact, the less factual, the better in terms of social media and online virality. Established and trusted presence in the spaces where misinformation is abounding is the single most effective counter to it. And this is not a presence that you can establish after the fact. There's any number of aphorisms and sayings attributed to Mark Twain that may or may not have been actually said by Mark Twain or written by him. But in any case, a lie travels around the world awfully fast these days, and it's we don't want to be left with the truth just trying to get their boots on before that lie makes it around the world. And I think that if that was true in Mark Twain's era, imagine how much more true it is now that it takes about a fraction of a second for a social media post to go all around the world and be seen by literally millions of people. If it was true in the era of letters via ship and Pony Express, then um, today it's a real daunting challenge, but it is an important challenge because there isn't a scarcity of accurate and real-time information. And this is particularly true during any number of rapidly unfolding events. They could be crises or not, or disasters or something else. But this problem is particularly acute when people are desperate for correct or up-to-date, timely information in a moment that it is not forthcoming from other sources. That is where I think scientist communicators or expert communicators of any kind can be especially helpful if your presence is established and before the rapidly unfolding event occurs. That's because TV, radio, news are often, it was cutting edge 50 to 70 years ago, but now, if you're 6 to 24 hours behind what's going on in the world, people are looking elsewhere for that information. And indeed, the television and radio news these days, certainly newspapers, but TV, radio, and even internet-based text format news sources are often sufficiently behind the times that people go elsewhere for their most timely information. And social media is usually where that somewhere is. But as you know, social media can be highly unreliable. In fact, perhaps the default state is that it is not reliable. So official sources of information, as always, if there's a wildfire, people say, oh, check the CAL FIRE website or listen to advice from the county sheriff or whatever the case may be. But the problem here again is that even these official information sources, though they are probably more authoritative, they're often not updated often enough or in a timely enough way, especially during a rapidly unfolding event. And also, they still tend to experience major communications outages. I'm mostly talking about episodic ones caused by perhaps a disaster, but just look to this week where there's nationwide telecommunication outages from the Amazon web server outages that seem to have knocked out everything from 911 service on people's cell phones to, and I kid you not, apparently people's smart beds lost internet connection and overheated dangerously. So in our interconnected world, you never know what kind of problem is going to become a crisis. Uh, so I think with caution, with some caution, but not too much caution, because then we won't do enough of this online engagement by scientists, by practitioners, by domain experts, by anybody who can speak clearly and authoritatively and in a way that is understandable by any sort of expert can help fill this critical gap. And we need more people to step up, and we also need institutions, by the way, to support their employees who are doing this. That's maybe a conversation for another day, or maybe ask me afterward my thoughts on that one. But we really need this. And some institutions are better positioned than others to support their employees in doing so. I think A&R is a good example of an institution that is certainly positioned to do so. In all of these cases, nuance and context, which are, in some circles, unfortunately, and I would argue very, in a very damaging way, dirty words these days, even though they're two of my favorite words, nuance and context, we really need these things, to understand and respond constructively to challenges, because otherwise we may be responding reactively, impulsively, with incomplete information, or without the full context to understand the sum and totality of the forces at play that drive a problem that we want to solve. And so if we are too quick to jump the gun and attribute a problem to too narrow a list of things, or perhaps an incorrect causative list in the first place, then we aren't going to be able to solve the problem as quickly or as efficiently or as equitably as we would like to, because we're misdiagnosing the patient, if you will. So personally, I have as I mentioned, I won't belabor the point on this, but a portfolio of weather, climate, and natural hazard research, weather and weather adjacent extremes in a warming climate that includes things like atmospheric rivers and the potential floods they produce, but also the water supply they provide, droughts and floods themselves, and related human and environmental impacts, and increasingly wildfire, especially as wildfire relates to weather and climate, but also risk assessment of those fires and the kind of situations where we're able to perform prescribed burning successfully and safely in a way that improves ecosystems and reduces the risk of harm during subsequent wildfires. So, and the lens through which I look at all of these things is thinking about how climate change may or may not be a driver of shifts in the underlying physical phenomena as well as their associated hazards. So what do I actually do? I've been talking a lot in the abstract about how I engage. What do I actually do in practice? As I mentioned, I conduct a lot of interviews with journalists every year, probably around 250 per year. So I am around the 250 mark for this current year at the moment. A lot of these are in episodic bursts. Sometimes I'll do 20 or 30 interviews in a week because there's a particularly newsworthy event that is going on. There's a lot of demand for people explaining what's going on in broader context. I frequently will be on television. I have some semi-recurring slots on different programs on the Weather Channel, on CNN, the BBC, for example. I think my career total is now getting close to 2,000 news media interviews. So if you have questions about my experiences, I now have what is, I think, a legitimately statistically significant sample size to talk about my experience with interviews and things that go well, things that don't go well, and about how often the pitfalls or the successes, the triumphs actually occur. I can give you my rough estimate from now a four-figure number of instances here. Uh, I really like to prioritize podcasts these days because it reaches a broader demographic of people, including younger people. I like the archival aspect of it too, because sometimes people actually do go back and listen to past iterations of podcasts. No one reads yesterday's newspaper, but people do go and listen to a podcast from 6 months ago. Uh, and I like the long format of them too sometimes because you can have longer form conversations. And the topic of all of these, as I mentioned, is often climate, weather, and wildfire focused. Um, and I do estimate, or I have quantified this audience, by the way, that the second order audience here through the journalists I've spoken to is generally in the tens of millions of people per year, because I will give those several hundred interviews across a roughly even distribution of local, state, national, and international outlets. And I do try to be a little, I know this isn't the typical context in which the term is used, but equal opportunity when it comes to the size of the media outlet, because I think it is important to support local journalism, and it is a way to ensure also that I'm expanding reach specifically within corners of California that are less well covered by even statewide outlets. The big state newspapers like LA Times or the San Francisco Chronicle, making sure sometimes to say yes to those local media outlets that might only reach a portion of a rural county somewhere in California, but they're really a lifeline for those small communities. As well as on the other side of things, thinking about, okay, if I say yes to this interview, and 10 million people will see it, that's also valuable from a mass audience perspective. So I take a dual approach. I'm neither trying to focus exclusively on small outlets and small communities, nor exclusively on the big outlets that reach people all across the state and the country. I think both are important. I also have I've helmed or authored the Weather West blog since 2006. So this is actually going on the 20th anniversary of that blog. Believe it or not, it is hard for me to believe, but we're almost there. Time flies. That is a way I'm directly reaching people. My audience is roughly 91% Californians, and I'm reaching about 250,000 of those people. So 91% of that number directly through the Weather West blog each year. This is more weather focused. This is more narrowly focused than my other stuff. And I think this draws what you could call sometimes a more climate skeptical audience because people don't feel like it's climate change everywhere all the time. And so this is an interesting opportunity I found to bring people into the fold, into the conversation who perhaps wouldn't show up, ever be seen on a climate change blog, but are still really interested in the day-to-day weather. And this actually does include a large contingent of agricultural folks, both people who own and operate farms and also some people who work as laborers on farms or who work for big agribusiness companies that manage farms. There's actually a very large agricultural contingent among the Weather West readers, and there's even quite a community in the uh, semi-moderated comment section. I will also add I'm the sole moderator of these 250,000 comments a year, so occasionally things slip through, but it's kind of a special community. It's a really, given how off the rails online comment sections can go in social media these days, it is a remarkably focused, supportive community for the most part, with some occasional exceptions when I'm not available to do that full-scale moderation. I'm also very active on social media. My balance of focus has shifted over the years. It was originally Twitter, then Twitter became X, and it is not my preferred platform anymore, but I am still present there because I do believe it is important to reach all audiences. And unfortunately, the social media platforms have now become much more politically partisan. So if you want to reach multiple sides of the political aisle, you really do have to be present on multiple social media sites. So it is probably accurate to say that Blue Sky is more left-leaning, and Twitter, or what is now X, is now more right-leaning politically. So you're going to reach potentially different audiences there. YouTube, I think, is actually one of the more neutral ones, both in terms of demographics, in terms of age, that you actually are reaching older and younger folks to some extent, which is not so true on the other sites. You're either reaching one or the other. And there's a little bit more, I think, of an ideological range still on YouTube too, at least based judged on the comments. I think that would be evidence there. Here, I'm able to directly measure my social media reach, and it's around 30 to 50 million eyeballs on the screen per year. Exactly what that translates to in terms of uh, engagement is a little bit of an open question, but it is a large audience of people who see the content that I am directly producing and sending out in text, visual, and video format on social media. And again, the focus here is broader than the Weather West blog. It's weather, climate, wildfire, environment, disasters, environment-related policy, all these kinds of things. And then, of course, there's also the direct outreach, which I am scaling up now that I am full-time UC A&R. But as it was previously, I meet with about 10,000 people in person and virtually in small group settings, the mix of those two things per year. And these are different kinds of interactions, of course, because these aren't people scrolling past your post on Twitter or glancing for 10 seconds at your YouTube video. These are people who showed up and sat down for at least an hour, and sometimes a lot more than that, to have a more in-depth and sometimes in-person conversation. That includes these kinds of community lectures, facilitated conversations. Tomorrow, for example, I'm going over to the Cosumnes River Preserve to speak to give a guest lecture at the Climate Stewards course that's being held there this fall. Facilitated conversations, events. I do nights at the museum. I've done that in LA County in the Bay Area. I'll be in Long Beach in February, for example, at the Long Beach Aquarium doing their quarterly evening event there, talking about weather and climate. Working with community groups like Firewise groups in Marin County and Santa Clara County and all these places in Northern California that are trying to quickly impose some lessons learned from recent fires, and then things like direct briefings to various policy makers. I've given state and federal level congressional testimony. Um, I've done a couple of White House events. And then I also do work both in my official UC capacity and then separately as well with various folks in the private sector to essentially bring science to action. Thinking a lot about working with companies that are trying to do risk modeling and people in the insurance sector and in the wildfire world as well. And then I do occasional popular science writing. So I'll write like an article, an invited article for Outside Magazine or something, or a perspective piece for Nature. Those are reaching, of course, very different audiences as well. So my point is really, the portfolio is strategically broad. I'm trying to reach not just as many people as possible, but a combination of tactics, reaching mass audiences in the millions, even though those touch points might be a little bit weaker, and then also trying to reach at least thousands of people every year within California with a more in-person, direct kind of connection. This is just a silly photo collage of the various ways that I do this, and ending with my favorite one, which was a double translated live television interview on Iraqi TV, which was translated first from English to Arabic and then from Arabic to Iraqi Kurdish in real time. That was probably one of the most challenging interviews I've ever done. It turned out it wasn't even on the topic that I thought it was going to be about, by the way. I had read up on the climate of that part of the Middle East, and it turned out it was actually a news story about a typhoon in Japan. So, but learning to pivot during an interview is perhaps something we can talk about. So, where am I online these days? As I mentioned, there's the Weather West blog, Blue Sky, and YouTube are kind of my key focal social media platforms at the moment. Uh, and one of my primary use cases for YouTube, although I'm expanding those too, is my recurring virtual live weather and climate office hours. These are open to the public, and I encourage public participation through the comment section. So I answer people's questions in real time. Sometimes it's an open-ended office hours, kind of ask me anything sessions. Sometimes, but more often they're topically focused. If there is an ongoing weather event or a wildfire event or a disaster, sometimes I'll walk people through it. I'll use live Weather Channel style, weather radar, satellite imagery, or I'll pull up fire cameras and talk about the dynamics of wildfire spread, various things like that, depending on what the case is. I'll talk about the role of the Weather Service during various public policy debates, what's at stake if certain public policy proposals, as I like to say, are implemented or as they have been implemented this year. Wide range of topics, but the key part is it's interactive and it's open to the whole world. But again, it is mostly a California-centric audience, including journalists. And journalists often use this as a de facto press conference because I'm able to respond to one journalist who might ask a question, but then that response then therefore goes out to the world at large, meaning that any other journalist can use what I say as a verbatim quote. That's a little bit, that's a little bit of a risk, but it is, for me, a very strategic use of time. Secondary channels, as I mentioned, Twitter, which is now X. That landscape has changed dramatically in the past 2 years, and if anyone's interested, I can talk about a little more what I mean about that. I am also on LinkedIn, and it was not something that I was particularly active on until recently, but with the bifurcation of the social media world recently, it's certainly not a great platform for real-time emergency updates, but in some ways it is less toxic than other other platforms, and I think some people have uh, increased their presence there recently. So not a primary platform, but I am there, and I will post some of the very most important but not super time-sensitive things there because there is growing engagement over there, and I know some people feel safer there than on a place like the X platform these days. I am also on Threads and Mastodon. These are much smaller, arguably more niche audiences. They're great for reaching some fellow academics, but they are not good for chronological timelines. So for real-time weather, disasters, wildfires, they are really not appropriate. And you're not really necessarily reaching across ideological aisles or demographic ones. It's a great way to reach out to other academics. It's not such a great way to reach other audiences that you are likely trying to engage with in your extension role. So who is my audience? Pam asked me to include some early survey results. So I'm a newcomer to survey construction and analysis because I am essentially an applied physicist rather than a social scientist. But I'm just checking on my time here. Okay. Let me make sure that I'm actually doing okay here on timing. I'm just going to pull out my own cell phone. I probably should have. Oh, there's a clock in the room, but the clock is off. I wonder if that is a Amazon cloud issue related problem. The clock in my rental car was off for similar reasons. Anyway, an interconnected world. So who is my audience? So I'm a newcomer to designing surveys and analyzing them, but this is a survey that I started sending out in September. So this is about a month and a half worth of results. I got nearly 2,000 responses. So again, a significant um, respondent rate already. I don't think it's a statistically representative sample of my audience. There are a lot of people who responded from Facebook and YouTube. So these answers so far are very representative of my Facebook and YouTube specific audience, but perhaps less so the rest of it. So I'm working on ways to do better, more statistically representative sampling. But without further ado, one of the most important things that I wanted to ask in this first year of assessment is where are you within California? And I also asked, by the way, whether you were in California or in some other state, or whether you were in international. And by where are you, I did ask where the primary place of residence. So if people are in different places at different times, where are you most of the time? And it turned out that about 2 or 3% of people who responded said that they were outside of the United States. About 7% of people said they were within the United States, but outside of California. And then the remainder, so again, about 93% of people said that they were in California. And here's the county level distribution of results. There are some interesting things here, along with some unsurprising things. The thing I was most pleased to see personally is that it does seem, even with this incomplete sample, that I am, with my current activities, reaching people even in parts of California that are low population or that don't often make the news. So there is a pretty good showing from some low population rural counties here. And some of the results are fairly obvious. The single most populous county in California is the county with the highest rate of respondents, which is LA County, not surprising there. But there's some interesting ones too, like Sonoma is number two, and Sonoma is definitely not the second most populous county in California. So there's a lot of North Bay Area interest. So again, Marin, Sonoma, and I believe also Napa making a pretty solid showing here. Disproportionately so from their fraction of California's population, which is interesting. There's a lot of engagement from San Francisco, North Bay, and then also from the Southern California metro counties. So there's a good showing from San Diego, as I mentioned, LA County, as well as Orange County here as well, and Ventura. So a lot of sort of Central Coast. That probably aligns with California's population pretty well. But we also have a good showing for the most populous counties. But if you look down lower on the list, I'm fascinated. There's a lot of folks who are responding or at least some folks responding from some counties that I did not expect to see as high on the list as they are, given population. So San Benito County, Plumas County, Madera County, Tehama County, even. So there are a few places where the showing is not as great yet, but it's something room to expand, and also a good indication that at least geographically, I'm encouraged by this initial sort of time zero initial snapshot. One other question I wanted to ask for this initial cohort of questions was, okay, where are most people engaging? Now, again, uh, this may not be fully representative because it's a biased sample in the sense that I'm soliciting answers from some of these platforms, so your mileage may vary. But I did find it really interesting that the number one place was the Weather West blog. It was this very California-centric, very weather-focused platform where the largest number of people said that they were engaged with my weather and climate communication activities. Now, again, people can select multiple answers here, and in fact, I suspect many people did. I haven't looked at the crosstabs, but the single most common response was the Weather West blog. Then a close second is social media generally. That includes any potential channel. The next most common, and it's a pretty distant third, is the traditional media. So newspapers, television, just an indication that being online and meeting people where they are in virtual cyberspace is maybe one of the most important things to do. Virtual in-person events, there's a decent number of people there too. Again, this may change if I change my survey sampling, but it is not, it is a pretty small number compared to the cumulative total of social media and the Weather West blog. So, as you might expect, there's a lot of engagement on social platforms. And then the other thing I wanted to ask was essentially about um, the frequency of engagement, how many times are people engaging? And the answer appears to be quite frequently, in the sense that the vast majority of people who responded to the survey, again, over 1,200 people said that they've sort of had more than 20 touch points with my weather and climate communication. That was the single most common answer. I did not expect that to be the case, or I might have used some higher bins here. But essentially, almost all survey respondents said that they had interacted with my weather and climate engagement more than twice, so at least 3 times, which is I found that kind of remarkable. There's a lot of return engagement, which I think hopefully speaks to perhaps something about the value of it because people keep coming back. And I just created a word cloud rather than do a more substantive scientific analysis of the free form part of the survey, but I just thought folks would find this interesting. Unsurprisingly, weather is right at the center of all of these. Climate is a smaller one, but an important piece. Things like wildfire, California. But people really did express that they didn't have any other way to receive this information, which I find remarkable in our information age, that the personal, specific outreach that people are really seeking, people find it to be, perceive it to be incredibly valuable, and that it is not otherwise available. So I just thought I'd reflect on that a little bit. So how do I make it work? And I know that I'm maybe running a little bit long, which would not be the first time. So I'll try and go a little bit more quickly through the last few of these. But one thing I want to point out is I'm not necessarily saying that everybody should try and replicate what I do. I am not a paragon of work-life balance, and I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. What I do does require very high time flexibility. Like this morning, I dropped everything to do 3 interviews in a row before popping over from the hotel to A&R offices in Davis. Um, it does mean that I'm working pretty much every night and every weekend. And I'm not Elon Musk. I'm not telling you that this is a good thing or that you should be doing it. In fact, I'm actively working to try and not be doing that all the time. But I just want to reflect that sometimes people express to me their frustration that they just don't have time to do some of the things that I'm suggesting. And I totally get it because I am in somewhat of a unique position, certainly an unusual and perhaps unique position to be able to push in this way. And even then, it is genuinely challenging sometimes. One of the strategies I use is I like to call it my Swiss cheese calendar. By the way, this little graphic on the left is a custom graphic that I'm very proud of, representing my Swiss cheese calendar. Uh, what I mean by that is it's strategically and deliberately full of holes all the time, even though I know it's going to be filled with something by the time the hour comes up. But if you look at my Google Calendar for next week, it looks suspiciously empty for somebody with a full-time appointment at a university system, but I guarantee you all those hours will be filled. But by keeping it open, I can say yes to things at the last minute constantly. And I think that's one of the reasons why I end up being asked to do so many news interviews is I generally am able to say yes more often than no, regardless of the notice I'm provided. That can be a pretty intense experience during disasters, as I mentioned. I won't focus too much on that today, but just some practical realities. It, as I mentioned, all of this is really only possible because of my somewhere between unusual and unique job. I do believe it's one of the only ones like it within the University of California system by design, um, and that it can be really difficult to find external funding for academics to do this in a more traditional university setting. So I'm really fortunate to currently have some base funding from A&R to do this, and then also to be supported philanthropically through gifts from external foundations to do the science communication. What I do right now, my role, especially in this present funding moment, would not be possible, period, without that kind of support. But it's not easy to find that kind of support. It does mean strategically I have to borrow time from myself, if you will, during intense periods uh, for use during calmer times. So when there is a week where I'm, working 12, 13, or 14 plus hours a day, that means that there's got to be some other week, some other time where I'm working less than 8 hours a day, just for the basic math of life and human needs to work out in the long run. And I do benefit from that flexibility, my ability to do that and to work when it's needed and to work somewhat less, although I'm finding that I need to probably do more of that. Does it balance out in the long run? Maybe not. There is a personal cost, I'm to be quite brutally honest that, balance can be something that's difficult to achieve. So that just brings up the question of how to be more sustainable in the space. And that's something I invite discussion about as well. And just let me make sure, once again, that I'm leaving some time for discussion here. But I think, and this is something that I shared with the UC Regents as well as with Glenda earlier this summer, because I think it's helpful in articulating why all of this matters. And being present in the social media environment and with traditional media environment with journalists and just in general, engagement in general. Uh, but the social part is important because it really does help advance intrinsic values to produce better outcomes. Scientists, practitioners, we really should be trying, at least in my view, to avert preventable harm when we're trying to make a bad thing less bad and improve lives when we're trying to make something that could be better good. It really does help enhance public understanding of complexity, which can facilitate better functioning, more efficient, and hopefully a more just society. Sounds a little pie in the sky, but I really do think this is an important piece of making that happen. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of inspiring awe and wonder regarding the natural world. Sometimes I literally just post cloud photos or solicit other people's cloud photos and tell them what they're seeing, if it's weird, unusual, or perhaps a little more ordinary than they had hoped. I think that that's an important way of just inspiring awe and making people remember that we live in a cool place and that we should do what we can to make sure it stays that way. It can definitely foster research synergies, both basic and applied research. It can really highlight what science questions are really worth pursuing, especially those which are most societally relevant. I don't think scientists are always the best at discerning what questions are most societally relevant, and so that engagement is necessary to realign the scientific hypothesis asking or setting. It facilitates numerous and high quality collaborations. I can't tell you the number of amazing things I have to say no to because I just don't have any more hours in the day, but it's a really good problem to have, let me tell you. Uh, and I'm grateful to have it. And maybe even more importantly these days, it promotes visibility of science in the public sphere and its practice and application in society. It promotes visibility of scientists as human beings, which of course we all are, of practitioners as well, their competence, their relevance, their humanity, of institutions, their importance, what they aim to accomplish, and how they potentially set out to do that. And as I mentioned, especially these days, in the eyes of potential funders, particularly non-traditional ones. And I say that because this is how I am funded to do what I do today is largely through uh, philanthropic contributions that came about because of my public visibility and the fact that these philanthropic funders really wanted me to do more of this. And I say, well, you can support institutions like ANR because they are supporting me, and that will indirectly help me out as well as incentivize institutions to encourage more of this kind of engagement. Oh, and this is just another, since I'm not much of an artist myself, I'm leaning on other people's artistic interpretations of me on social media and in the media from various stages of facial hair in my life, including one where I appear to be roughly 4,000 feet tall, or in one case with my head literally in the clouds, which I thought was kind of funny. But just to show that sometimes you reach unexpected levels of cultural relevance without trying. despite your best efforts to remain culturally irrelevant. Um, and let me just check. Pam, are
You
we
have
okay
about
to
5 minutes left.
Okay.
If you could kind of wrap it up and take some questions.
Yeah, so I just want to, I think we've already talked a little bit about this, but there's, the social media world is evolving rapidly, and it's really important. The main point of this is it's really important to be present there, to have a presence there, to serve as a countervailing force against the misinformation, the silly virality that might otherwise occur. Harness virality for good is maybe the simple, quick way of saying that. And I'm going to skip this since I actually already talked about it. A couple of practical tips: what kind of social media is most engaging. It varies widely by platform. There's major generational divides. Facebook skews older. TikTok, of course, skews very young and is nearly ubiquitous among the youngest audiences, and the rest of them are kind of in between. YouTube spans generations. Journalists and policymakers are now most active on Blue Sky and still on X, for better or for worse. Often content that is in some form surprising or counterintuitive or responsive to current events often does very well and has some chance at going viral. And in general, as much as I hate to say it, we all need to pivot to video versus text or image because that's what's most widely consumed these days. Some best practices, thinking about, I used to call it minimum tweetable increments. I now structure my own papers and maybe speak in daily conversation that way for, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but really distilling the essence of the most essential aspect of what you're trying to convey is important. Um, Using simple language and often avoiding field-specific jargon, but also not being afraid to use that jargon if, in fact, your audience is field-specific, which it sometimes might be disciplinary. And it's sometimes okay to have posts oriented toward different audiences. One post that's for a general audience that doesn't use a jargon, and another one that is fairly jargonistic that is targeted toward those people who are going to know what you're talking about. Um, Also, for video content, audio and video quality really matters. It's not good enough to just use the computer mic in most cases, although, of course, that's what I'm doing today. So do as I say, not as I do. Video quality, internet quality are really important when you're recording things as well. I know you already talked about personal branding earlier, so I'll cut that out. And I can talk about this as well, the strategies for navigating what I'll just call euphemistically and generously not so subtle criticisms. Um, but ultimately, the best way to engage social media, traditional media, otherwise, is on your own terms. Pick and choose what you're comfortable with. Format, platform, topic, whatever it might be. You get to decide what context is acceptable for you. But choose something. That's my advice. We really all do need to be engaging on some level where and when we find it's appropriate. Uh, and consider accepting invitation to appear on other people's social media channels and accounts or podcasts, by the way. That means you don't necessarily have to do all the build up and administrative work, but can capitalize in some respect on the work that other people have done. Be a guest on a podcast or a live stream or community meeting, because these are nice soft points of entry here that can actually be really high value to communities. And also, finally, if you've had one bad experience, don't let that dissuade you from trying again in the future. I can assure you from my statistically significant sample size that more often than not, journalists are trying to do the right thing, and more often than not, get it more right than wrong, and that your contribution is going to be valuable. And the same thing is true of social media. All right, so I have a secondary layer of closing thoughts, but I think I'll close with that and open the floor to questions since I do want to have some time for them.
Before you got on today, Royce had asked about if you get a gut feeling that an interview may not be for you, how do you handle that?
Hmm.
I don't know whether that would be based on the journalist or the outlet.
Yes, I think it could be either. Well, there's really three litmus tests that I might apply for myself or that someone else might consider applying for in their own experience. Sometimes they are outlet or journalist based. If you've had a particularly bad experience, for example, with a specific journalist, that is usually that is one of my strongest red flags, especially because it's a rare occurrence in my experience. So it is a significant red flag. If I've had 500 interactions with other outlets and then there's one particular journalist who is on two occasions there's been some issue, that's going to really disincentivize my now, I realize that most people don't have that sample size to draw upon. So, but if you've heard from others, through the rumor mill, through strategic communications, that there have been some issues with certain outlets in the past, then that could be one. But also, sometimes we do want to reach broader audiences. We want to give people second chances, and I wouldn't make that a very hard and fast rule. Sometimes we do want to give journalists a chance to try again. Sometimes outlets can have very different types of journalists working for them, and so one journalist might be great, one might not be so great, especially if it's a larger outlet. The main thing is topic, though. I think it's topical. Is the topic at hand that you want to talk about appropriate for the context of your domain expertise? I usually think, on average, most scientists and domain experts undersell the breadth of their own expertise, meaning that you can speak on a broader range of topics than you think, since you don't need to be the world expert in something. You need to be conversant in a reasonably authoritative and fact-based way. Are you going to, the litmus test I often use for myself is if I say no, is the next person on the list they're going to call going to know more or less about this thing than I do? If the answer is no, then I often feel obligated to say yes. But if over the context of a conversation or an interview, this is difficult when they're live, but if it veers into territory that you're not comfortable with, which often happens, I've had a couple of interviews that have just gone a completely different direction than what the journalist originally said the topic was going to be about. That's tough if it's live. If it's not live, you can be quite honest and just say, this is sort of, we've sort of veered outside of my realm of expertise. If it's live, you can be a bit of a politician and try and bring it back to something you're comfortable talking about and saying, well, that's a really important issue, but I think one of the bigger issues here is this other thing that I'm going to talk about now, and try and lead the conversation in that direction. And if they're good journalists, they'll get the hint, especially, and most people who do live broadcasts have enough experience by virtue of the role that they have to understand that how to roll with that kind of pivot.
Thanks. Well, we're past 3 o'clock. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Just open up your mic and speak. There's a few. Edith?
Edith's going.
Hi, Daniel. Um, I'm the cooperative extension specialist at UCLA. So I was very excited when we were here for like 5 minutes together at UCLA, but now I'm back to being an only child of A&R at UCLA. My question is, so in the weeks following the fires, I got a tiny glimpse of what it feels like to be you on a standard kind of calendar. And I found it, especially multiple interviews in a day, to be quite mentally taxing. You talked about work-life balance is not necessarily a thing for you, but I'm curious about work-work balance because you have your research side and then you have this very substantial communication side. So what are your thoughts about that? I mean, I'm certain that it's you don't have a cloning machine that enables you to be multiple places at once. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, if I had a cloning machine, I'd also want like a gene editing machine to fix my immune system, because that's actually, I have a pretty significant immune system disorder that is often very energy limiting, and this is actually an important part of how I manage my time or don't appropriately, is that it's physically difficult sometimes to get through a day with like 10 or 12 interviews. Like I think at some point anybody is exhausted after 12 consecutive interviews, but it can be like I will physically lose my voice sometimes, and that will be the end of the interviews for the day. Like I literally will not be able to form words anymore from my exhausted vocal cords. So this is one reason why I first wanted to emphasize that don't use me as like a direct model to emulate. I don't think that's optimal even for me, so I'm working on it. But I think the practical reality is that when I say I borrow time for myself, that also is true in work-work balance as well, in the sense that I will drop everything research-wise in a moment of need for during a disaster or something, and I'll just do that full time for a day, a week, a month when things are really bad. And then I will equally start saying no to most interviews that aren't extremely time critical. for an extended period thereafter so I can catch up with the thing that I'm actually supposed to be doing, I know on the other side of work, which is the research and writing papers and things like that. So I will, and I don't have field work in the same sense that some others do, so I'm able to do that structurally. Like I can delay. I don't have to be present for a crop blooming at a particular moment or a particular sequence of events. Like I can reorder my work life to accommodate that in a way that not everybody can. But that is sort of how I pursue it. And there is some give and take where if there's been an especially intensive media or public outreach period, I do sort of have to balance that just to make zero sum game and at least in terms of number of hours per year to get everything else done. So and I do that as well personally, where I'll try and to the extent that I can recharge. As I say, I think we all feel this to some extent. I don't think it balances out necessarily, but I do think it is a way to make it work and to borrow time from yourself. Keep that Swiss cheese schedule. Sometimes the Swiss cheese means, oh, great. And on the rare occasions where nothing pops up, like this is a moment where I can do the thing I've been needing to do for like 3 months now. Write that paper, get those edits out, respond to that start email from last December. I try not to be that bad about it, but
Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate everyone who making time to join this webinar. And I know Vice President Humiston is very concerned about science literacy right now, especially with so much disinformation out there. And we all appreciate when people make the time to speak to the news media or to engage with the public. Daniel shared this article recently about the need for experts to speak out. It says if facts and expertise are to continue to be influential in this new public sphere, they must be communicated in ways that build connection and credibility. And experts must prioritize building trust through regular engagement with the public. And I dropped a link to the paper in here. I think it's really interesting. I know that everyone is already maxed out, especially cooperative extension people don't keep regular hours. But any little thing you can do to lend, I think is helpful.
And Pam, I just would echo that. I really do think it is a question of any little thing you can do, since it's not, I think, a situation where everyone's going to be able to drop everything like I do. It's just not structurally, practically possible, I think, for the vast majority of people. But it is these incremental pieces. That article, I think, is a great way. I found myself, the reason I sent it to Pam and everyone else in strategic communications is that I found myself nodding vigorously. Like I'm not usually a very visible nodder. And I just was absolutely, this echoes my personal experience. And importantly, it means that, organizations maybe need to be a little more on the offense with the communications environment as it is. And that means that every little bit counts.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to wrap up here and we'll make the slides available to everyone and the recording if you like it. Send that out. Thank you again for making time to join us, and reach out to Stratcom if we can help you with your communications efforts.
Thank you to everyone out there, all the cooperative extension professionals who are moving that ball inch by inch forward. As Daniel says, it all adds up and it makes a difference. Thanks to Daniel and thanks to everyone for joining us today.